The Mossad's reputation is legendary, but even legends make mistakes. And in the 1970s, they made a big one. Israeli foreign intelligence turned down a request to assassinate a rising Iranian extremist, thinking his own people would take care of him. But they didn't. And his regime has been terrorizing the region ever since. Welcome to the Islamic Republic of Iran. There are plenty of corrupt, violent governments in the world. So why was this the Mossad's biggest mistake? Iran's regime has unleashed a campaign of repression. The regime is really brutal. The brutal regime that has ruled Iran for decades. But Iran used to be pretty tight with the West, including Israel.
שיתוף הפעולה עם ישראל היה עתיד. מי לימד אותם חקלאות? מי הקים להם את כל הסכרים הכי גדולים? בנינו להם מדינה.
But by the late 1970s, the honeymoon was coming to an end. Iran's pro-Western secular king was in trouble. On the one hand, the Shah had modernized his country in a very short amount of time. Under his rule, Iran's economy grew by leaps and bounds. Literacy rates skyrocketed. Women thrived. Foreign businesses jockeyed to invest. Some Westerners predicted that Iran would soon be a first-world country, able to compete with the most developed European nations.
Our country, in the next 10 years, will be what you are today. In the next 25 years, according to other people, I'm not saying that, will be among the 5 most prosperous countries of the world.
On the other hand, the Shah wasn't exactly an unproblematic fave. Like most people who unironically call themselves King of Kings, the Shah was more interested in maintaining his power than building a democracy. He used the same playbook as dictators everywhere, controlling the press, surveilling citizens, jailing and torturing dissidents, the classics. His secret police was among the most fearsome in the Middle East. That's partially because many Iranians refused to recognize the Shah's authority. They saw him as little more than a puppet of the West, who had been propped up by the Brits and the Americans and represented the lingering influence of Western imperialism. To make matters worse for the Shah, his reforms didn't benefit everyone equally. True, the economy was growing, but so was the gap between rich and poor. Iran's wealth and progress weren't evenly distributed, and the Iranian people were taking notice. Opposition to the Shah was growing, and he knew it. But his most dangerous opponent wasn't the secular intelligentsia, the radical students, or even the middle class. It was a hardline religious cleric named Ayatollah Khamenei, because Khomeini had the rare ability to appeal to a lot of different types of people. Like the intellectuals, he was disgusted by the Shah's human rights abuses, not to mention the hypocrisy of Western powers who waxed poetic about human rights while supporting the Shah's regime. But Khomeini also viewed the Shah's modernizations and reforms as an attack on Islam. He wanted a theocratic government, and the Shah, who liked his luxuries, wasn't exactly a pious ruler. Khomeini's words found an eager audience. He and his followers flooded Iran with cassette tapes with his fiery sermons. Soon, they'd coalesce into a movement, an angry one. The Shah could read the writing on the wall, but he had become sick and couldn't do much about it. So he fled his country, leaving a temporary prime minister to rule instead. I feel bad for the new guy. If Khomeini's movement succeeded, keeping his job would be the least of his worries. He'd be lucky to keep his head. So within a day, he turned to the Mossad with a request. Get rid of Khomeini. Please. The Mossad knew Khomeini was bad news. The guy was a total extremist who accused the Shah of being, among other things, that Jewish spy, that American snake, whose head must be crushed with stone.
Well, isn't that special?
So, Israel considered the request. Should they get rid of Khomeini? Or was he all bark and no bite? On the one hand, the guy was clearly bad news for Israel, but he was also a political leader. Sure, he delivered some ugly sermons and made some serious threats, but he hadn't actually committed any acts of terrorism. He may have been popular, but there was no way the Iranian military would let him take power. So the Mossad decided not to get involved. Like every other Western intelligence agency, they'd underestimated Khomeini. Less than a month after the Shah's escape, the fiery cleric took over the government.
The Ayatollah Khamenei appears tonight to have come to full power in Iran, as he said he would, in another of those bloody convulsions that have recently swept the country.
Seemingly overnight, millions of Iranians found themselves living under a fundamentalist Shia theocracy.
اینا با توجه ندارن که اسلام در این حالی که لکن اون روزی که فهمید قابل تربیت نیست 700 نفرشون را در یک جا در یهود بنی قریظه را در حجره رسول الله میپسن گردن میزنن به امر رسول الله.
But Khomeini's goons didn't just target ordinary Iranians. Less than a year after the Ayatollah's rise to power, a group of radical young students stormed the American embassy, inspired by his anti-American rhetoric.
The American embassy in Tehran is in the hands of Muslim students tonight. Some 60 Americans are now beginning their 6th day of captivity inside the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. The government of Iran must recognize the grave consequences which will result if harm comes to any
of the hostages. They kidnapped more than 50 Americans, holding them for over a year.
The hostages are in our hands, and we protect them strongly. And we are ready so that in the case of any military intervention, we will destroy them.
Iran's reign of terror had begun. Iran is huge. Khomeini's ambitions were bigger. He didn't just want to control his own country. He wanted to spread his version of Islam all over the globe. And he knew exactly how he wanted to do it. Terror. The Ayatollah's men were no strangers to violence. They'd already established a warm relationship with the Palestine Liberation Organization, who spent the 1970s hijacking planes, unaliving athletes and school kids. Some Iranian dissidents had even trained with the PLO. But Khomeini didn't approve of the PLO's style. He wanted to build a militia that was more in line with his own Islamist principles. And he knew just where to go. Southern Lebanon was full of Shia Muslims who had spent decades being neglected by the Lebanese elite. They were the perfect target, religious, disaffected, and with an axe to grind. The Ayatollah's men built a well-trained, heavily armed guerrilla force made up of Lebanese Shias who were loyal, first and foremost, to Iran. The militia had a grandiose name to match Khomeini's grandiose ambitions. The Party of God. In Arabic, Hezbollah. Right away, Khomeini's new baby started wreaking havoc. Not that Lebanon needed any more chaos. The tiny country was gripped by a brutal and complicated civil war, and it seemed like everyone was joining the party. The Lebanese were fighting each other. But at the same time, various factions were also fighting against Palestinians, Israelis, and Syrians. It was a mess. Hezbollah made it messier. They started by bombing IDF headquarters in Lebanon. Then, the American embassy. Then, the U.S. Marine and French Army barracks. And then, they took the show on the road. Spain, Kuwait, Greece, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Thailand, Argentina, Panama. Hezbollah attacked them all. Many of their targets were Jews or Israelis, but plenty were not. Because Hezbollah answers to Iran, and Iran has a lot of enemies, including the Arab Gulf states. In Palestine, in Iraq, and in almost every country in the region, Iran is funding, arming, and enabling radical, violent, and subversive cells. A Jewish community center in Latin America? A commercial plane? How did that serve Iran's aims? Simple. It showed off their ability to strike anywhere, anytime. If Israel insisted on existing, fine. Iran would use Hezbollah to make them pay for it. And no one could predict how or where they'd strike next. But what's in it for Hezbollah? Why are they just doing the bidding of a foreign country? Well, we can't dismiss religious idealism. But let's not forget that Iran pays Hezbollah generously to carry out its acts of terror, to the tune of $700 million a year. $700 million in a country strangled by international sanctions. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Because despite its weak economy, Iran manages to fund terrorist groups around the world. In Iraq, in Pakistan, in Bahrain, in Yemen, and Afghanistan, and Saudi Arabia, and Gaza, and the West Bank. It's a wildly diverse roster. Terrorist groups might all sound the same to an outside observer. They might all do similarly horrible things. But at the end of the day, they've all got their own interests and beliefs. So why would Iran invest in such a wide variety of terrorist groups? Well, Iran wants power, and the more power vacuums it can exploit, the more influence it will have in the region. But it also wants to get rid of Israel entirely. So the Iranian government is all too happy to finance their attacks on a country they call Little Satan. when Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and ordinary Palestinians invaded Israel, unaliving 1,200 people and taking another 240 hostage, Iranian leaders celebrated. Ma pishani va bazuye karahane مدبر و هوشمند و جوانان شجاع فلسطین رو می‌بوسیم. One spokesman praised the attack as the greatest success of the Islamic world. If you ask me, the Islamic world's greatest successes lie in its rich culture, scholarly achievements, and gorgeous architecture. This cruel, ahistorical, and mutually insulting statement tells you everything you need to know about the Iranian regime's messed up priorities. The October 7th attack brought another of Iran's terrorist prodigies into the limelight. For decades, Houthi rebels have been sowing chaos in Yemen, thanks to Iran's generous paycheck. But they decided to take a break from unaliving Yemeni civilians to raid ships and fire rockets at Israel, as well as U.S. military bases. In case anyone wasn't clear on the link between Iran and the Houthis, the Houthi flag makes it obvious. It proclaims, in green and red, God is the greatest, death to America, death to Israel, a curse on the Jews, victory to Islam. Aside from being a little petty, the flag is a direct spin-off of the Iranian regime's own catchy slogan, death to the U.S. and death to Israel. Oh, that's real creative. When the Iranian regime says death to Israel, they mean it. And what's the best way to flatten a country of 9 million people? Nuclear weapons. Iran had been interested in nuclear development since the 1950s. Under the Shah, they signed a non-proliferation treaty, agreeing not to develop nuclear weapons. It enhances the security of all nations by significantly reducing the danger of nuclear war among nations. But the Shah's been gone since 1979. The fundamentalists in charge today have no interest in non-proliferation. And there is no doubt that the regime cannot be trusted with nukes. اینی که شما میگید مرگ در آمریکا یه شعار نیست صرفاً. این یک خط مشیه. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei has said the West couldn't stop Iran from building nuclear weapons even if it wanted to. It is no secret that we have become a nuclear threshold state, and this is a reality. It is also no secret that we have the technical capabilities required to manufacture a nuclear bomb, and though no one will publicly take credit for sabotaging Iran's nuclear program, plenty of countries have a vested interest in delaying the country's ability to build the bomb, including the Arab Gulf states. In fact, several Gulf states are so tired of Iran, they've normalized ties with Israel, and the Iranian regime is not happy about it. So they've done everything they can to stop a potential normalization deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia. As of October 7th, all talks have been suspended as Israel focuses on the war in Gaza. It's a real victory for the Iranian regime. Because they don't want peace. They don't want normalization or cooperation or stability. And no one is more aware of that than their own citizens. Because the regime's number one critics aren't Western governments or human rights experts or even the UN. It's ordinary Iranians themselves. They've tried to rise up against their government before. The regime has done its best to crush dissent. But the people are rising up. It's been a week of historic protests in Iran, a monumental shift for the Islamic Republic. Iran's Mawri policing brigade arrested a 22-year-old named Mossad. Her crime? Not wearing a headscarf. She died in custody 3 days after her arrest. The death of Mahsa Amini touched a really raw nerve, and that's why we're seeing these protests. Iranians are tired of being policed and harassed. They're tired of their government's utter lack of interest in human rights. They're tired of living under a strict, fundamentalist dictatorship that restricts the flow of information. They're tired of their crippled economy and their bad reputation and their totalitarian leaders. They're tired of their own government unaliving, SAing, torturing, and imprisoning them for crimes like showing their hair in public. They are more than ready for change. They're hungry for it. Iran's government has managed to destroy millions of lives, to brainwash innocent people into hatred and fanaticism and terror, to severely restrict its own citizens and trample all over basic human rights. But it has also brought out the resilience and strength of the Iranian people who have been shaking their country with the force of their rage. And as brave young people carry on the fight at home, expats across the world flock to pro-Israel rallies, making common cause with their one-time ally. It's not unusual to see a red, white, and green flag waving amid a sea of blue and white. There is absolutely no way I'm going to stay quiet, and I have to speak up, especially when I saw the people of Iran, the civilians of Iran, so bravely are showing their support for Israel and the people of Israel. Most ordinary Iranians aren't interested in wiping Israel off the map. They just want to get out from under their government's thumb and live freely. And I am looking forward to the day that they manage to topple their regime. I'm not a psychic or a time traveler. I can't say for sure what would have happened if the Mossad had agreed to assassinate Khamenei back in 1979. Maybe another ruthless despot would have taken his place. Maybe the Shah's government was always destined to crumble. But I do know that all empires eventually fall, and the Islamic Republic of Iran is no different. And the world will look much brighter once it does.